Hi everyone, welcome to the Great Books Big Ideas channel. I'm Jim, thanks for joining me. It's Friday, September 13th, time for a reading update. So let me tell you about a few books I've finished this week and a couple, maybe one or two new acquisitions and just books I'm currently reading. And I hope everyone is well, and I hope you're having a good reading week yourselves. So I had two library books that I just returned yesterday. And they were both by the author Sarah Bakewell. The first Sarah Bakewell book I read was called At the Existentialist Cafe, and I've done a full review of that. I'll link to it in the show description. That was a Goodwill find. I read it, I liked it, and I took it to the little free library. These two books are library books, so I found her latest book, which is called Humanly Possible, 700 Years of Humanist Freethinking, Inquiry, and Hope. And also, at the same time, I checked out How to Live, A Life of Montaigne. Both of these books were very good. Let me talk about the Humanly Possible book first. That was the one I finished first. This is her latest book. It's basically a 700-year survey of humanist thinkers in Europe, America, the West, let's call it. And she does touch on some other cultures too, but primarily it's starting with late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, with figures like Petrarch, and then going on up through the Renaissance, like thinkers like Montaigne, and into the early modern period, and up until the 19th century and the 20th century as well. So she hits a lot of the big figures along the way. I wanted to take notes on this book, but I just didn't really get around to it. And with library books, sometimes that's a problem. Like I got pretty close to the end of the window where I had to take it back. And I've been busy with some freelance writing work and also my remote teaching responsibilities. It's been a kind of a busy few weeks. So I just didn't do as much as I wanted to do in terms of actually writing down some notes for the book. But I can just give you the flavor of it. It's a sort of a breezy walk through that 700-year history. You get little thumbnail biographies of the figures, you get some historical context, you get a lot of intellectual history. And the theme that I guess comes across is that humanism is this thing that really emerges in the Renaissance as thinkers were reviving some of the ancient writers, rediscovering those manuscripts and publishing them. It also coincides with the rise of printing. And these ideas spread fast. But humanism, is about free thinking. It's about liberal thought. It's about openness to uncertainty, anti-dogmatic, and it's sort of founded on a belief in human progress. These are threads that she keeps stitching throughout the whole book, and it's what links a lot of the thinkers together. That being said, you can't really put a badge on humanism. It's not like a dogmatic thing. It's by definition not dogmatic. It's sort of anti-dogmatic, and oftentimes the foe of humanism would be the heavily dogmatic religions, or any kind of strict ideological thinking, which seems to have a problem with people thinking for themselves and so forth. So that's kind of where this book is at. Lots of nice little anecdotes sprinkled throughout. I did not think it was quite as strong as At the Existentialist Cafe, just in terms of it's like the scope was too broad. Like she's really covering a lot of territory here, so she can't cover any single period or single thinker in a whole lot of depth. but it certainly serves its purpose as being kind of it's like championing the cause of humanism and sort of celebrating. I would call it a celebration of humanism, and she's a champion of it. And it's an introduction. It's like a gateway drug that invites you to explore these thinkers a little bit more. So it definitely serves its purpose. It's written for a general readership. I didn't find it difficult to read at all. It was fun. It has some nice illustrations throughout, and I give it a thumbs up. I just don't think it's as solid of a book as At the Existentialist Cafe, because of the scope, the focus of it is a little too broad, so she kind of has to spread herself thin. Also, it's interesting, I feel like when you put a label on anything, it can be problematic for me. So I've always had a little bit of a problem with the label humanism. Any ism bugs me a little bit, it irks me. Whether it's liberalism, Marxism, communism, socialism, conservatism, right? It's just, it can get kind of confining. So to kind of brand humanism as humanism, and set up these us versus them dichotomies is, I'm not saying it's historically inaccurate, but it just feels a little bit too superficial, maybe, a way to think about it. Like these thinkers were individuals, people like Humboldt and Bertrand Russell and people like that. Like, they're their own beasts, and to sort of lump them all together, and not that Bakewell says they all thought the same thing. She's good at drawing the contrast, but it just feels a little bit like, maybe it's not entirely being doing full justice to the material. And in the 20th century, I really sort of, I guess it's partly from my upbringing. There was always the religious nuts were always against secular humanism. If it's just boogeyman that they had to be opposed to. And, that can be a trap to kind of be branded by the other side. And then you're going to be like, well, okay, well, I'll wear my secular humanist badge and we'll have organizations and we'll sort of have our little humanist club and defend what we do. I get that, but it's also not, to me, what humanism really is. It's kind of a shadow of what humanism ought to be. For instance, there are Christian humanists, there are Jewish humanists, there are humanists of any faith. Obviously, there's atheistic and agnostic humanists. And humanism is something that I feel like has gotten a bad rap, but I'm also just uncomfortable with the label itself. Maybe because of that. Maybe I don't want to call myself a humanist and wear it on my sleeve or on the armband, because I don't want to be bound to that, but yeah, if you press me on it, I'm definitely a humanist. My whole liberal education, the whole idea of getting a liberal education is sort of founded on humanist principles, isn't it? Read for yourself, think for yourself, connect with others, believe in human progress to some extent. These are all values that I hold pretty dear. So yeah, if you want to call me a humanist, that's fine. It doesn't bother me. But I don't like the sort of narrow sort of cliquishness that maybe it became in the 20th century. Maybe we'll move beyond that at some point. At this point in our culture, I think humanists are going to have to be living like monks. We're going to have to cloister ourselves and just try to preserve the culture and the tradition of free thought as much as we can, as we're being crowded out. Anyway, that's humanly possible. It's a nice introduction to a 700-year history of humanist thinking. Next is the book that I liked even better, called How to Live, A Life of Montaigne. Now, this book, again, I wish I could have taken notes on it. Just a brief thing about Montaigne. Montaigne was French, obviously, Renaissance, living in the 1500s. And I've read his essays. I read the Modern Library edition of his essays, which I'm trying to track down. I hope I didn't get rid of it. Like I go through like periodic book purges, and I hope I didn't get rid of my Montaigne. I think my wife has it in her office at work. But I asked her to check on it. But anyway, it was a kind of a game changer for me reading his essays, getting through all of them. And it just opened me up to a whole way of being on the page, being yourself, basically. And I thought Sarah Bakewell did a masterful job with this book. It's a biography of Montaigne, so you learn a lot of life details. It's also a reading of the essays. She quotes liberally from the essays. It's an intellectual history. It's also about the history of France and Europe during that period. The civil wars in France were nasty, nasty, nasty things. The Protestants against the Catholics, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, all the rest. Assassinations going on. And, how did Montaigne sort of survive, like, within all that turmoil on his estate near Bordeaux? That was an interesting tale. So here, the scope of the book is perfect, because it's like she's just looking at this one guy, but then sort of fanning out and seeing where his life touched other aspects of the age and how other aspects of the age touched him. And it's really well done. So I'm not typically a biography reader, but this was the kind of biography I like, because it wasn't just biography. You get a lot more. And she also kind of couches it in this sort of how-to mold, right? So each chapter is like how to be this, how to do that, like that kind of thing. And these are just basically like a way to frame it, but it was fun because you can learn a lot from Montaigne's example about how to live. And I think the biggest message of Montaigne is learn how to be yourself. Learn how to think for yourself. Don't be afraid of yourself. And consistency is not exactly anything to worry about. So she cast Montaigne as kind of a blend of a Stoic, an Epicurean, and a skeptic, which I thought that was a really nice way to analyze his character. I was sold on that way of understanding him. But getting back to my reading of Montaigne, this was back in my 30s, I think, when I read all his essays. I want to reread them for sure. But that Modern Library edition, I'm pretty sure, was the John Florio translation, which was a very famous translation that came out in the Elizabethan period. It would have been the version of Montaigne that Shakespeare would have read. And there's a lot of parallels between Montaigne and some of Shakespeare, especially plays like Hamlet, for example. But there are other translations out there, and she does a great job here of sort of taking you through the reception history of Montaigne's essays and the different translations it's gone through in English, and she weighs the pros and cons of them. So that was like excellent information. Also, I didn't realize that the Catholic Church had had banned the essays for I think a couple hundred years, something like that. It was on the list of banned books. So his and different periods of European intellectual history like were either hot or cold towards Montaigne. So she has chapters where she talks about how much Descartes and Pascal sort of were bothered by Montaigne. They weren't really fans. They had conflicted relationship with his essays. And then Romantic period saw different things in Montaigne that they liked, some of things they didn't like. So Montaigne just kind of sort of percolates along throughout the ages, and he's had his ups and downs in terms of reception. That was interesting to follow too. But if you've never read Montaigne's essays, I recommend them. Just one day I'll do some full-blown videos on him, so this will just be like scratching the surface. But my experience of reading him at the time was, first of all, he basically invents the modern essay, right? So the word essay in French means like an attempt to try. So each essay is like on some provisional topic, but it takes all these little detours and sort of sidebars and kind of wanders around through and in and outside of the topic. And it's like following a man's train of thought. And it's just really fascinating because this guy wrote hundreds of years ago, and you feel like you know him. By the end of the book, you're like, I feel like this man is my friend, right? And that was just fascinating. It just opened up a whole way of approaching writing, personal writing, and just he's very candid, he's very honest, and brave to that extent. So I really thought he was influencing me a lot. And this was back in the day in the early days of the internet, where I was working on my first blog, and this was on it was like the word blog was brand new at the time. I think I was blogging before we even called them blogs. They were sort of like little personal journals on the web, and there were different sites for that. One was called Live Journal and so forth, but Blogger, right, Blogspot, that was an early one. But initially I was just I think my first blog was on a site called GeoCities. Does anyone remember that? And then I think the successor to that might have been was it called Fortune City or Cities? I can't remember. But anyway, I've looked to see if these old sites are archived on archive.org, and I don't think mine was never snapshotted. That's probably a good thing. But anyway, the kinds of thoughts I was spinning out in that blog reminded me of what Montaigne's doing, and this was all kind of at the same time, so I think what Montaigne was doing was rubbing off on me, and I was like, hey, I can do that too, or at least I can try, and sort of write in my own way, in my own style. So I thought of him at the time as history's first blogger. I mean, that's basically what his essays are. The thing that surprised me about Montaigne when I first read him, and this is just a fair warning for you, is he talks a lot about other books, especially books in his personal library, and he was very steeped in classical literature and philosophy and history. Big fan of Plutarch, by the way, a book I just finished this year. And he will really dig into those and read passages and reference them and riff off of those. So that can be a little bit off-putting if you're not familiar with a lot of that stuff. But he blends that in with his own personal observations and experience. So it's not just about reading old sources. But that was, at times, that was a little bit hard to navigate, but on the whole, I loved his essays. And I had the chance as a professor when I was in the live classrooms to teach his essay on cannibals in a Western World Lit Survey class. And I really enjoyed teaching that essay. I hope the students got something out of it. And that's when I first came across Sarah Bakewell, because I found a YouTube clip with her talking about the book and about the life of Montaigne that I showed to the class. So that put her on the radar for me. Anyway, How to Live a Life of Montaigne, excellent book. I think of the 3 books by her that I've read in the last 2 months, How to Live a Life of Montaigne was probably the best. And then I would put At the Existentialist Cafe second, and then Humanly Possible third. But they're all good. They're all good. Now, what else have I been reading? Well, the Humanly Possible book put me in the mind of Petrarch, and I pulled him off the shelf over here. This is the Heritage Press edition of Petrarch's Sonnets, and it has illustrations by Aldo Salvadore, and it also includes the Italian of the poems. And there's various translators for these sonnets. And as I said in a previous video, I'm not super thrilled with the translations. I think you could probably do better. I would like to see a volume, maybe Penguin Classics has an edition, maybe Oxford World Classics or somebody like that has Petrarch out there. That's something I'll keep my eye out for. I'd like to see how a modern translator would handle these. A lot of these translations are old, and there's so much syntax inversion, forced rhyming, and so forth. And it just kind of clouds the meaning of the poems. It makes it like more difficult. And then I did sample some of the Italian, and I don't really read Italian, but I did study Latin, so they're not really exactly the same at all. But anyway, reading it aloud in Italian, I was noticing that it's got to be so much better in the Italian. Like, the rhymes aren't forced. He puns a lot on the name of Laura, the love of his life, the light of his life. And a lot of these puns just cannot be replicated in English translation, right? So what are these sonnets all about? Well, first of all, Petrarch was a really important figure in the Renaissance, not only for these poems, but he was arguably one of the fathers of the Renaissance. Like, he was instrumental in digging out these old manuscripts that were laying about in monasteries and so forth, and getting them into print and studying them. And he was really good at like kind of collating and comparing texts, and he was very much into that. He was a poet laureate in Italy, so he was friends with Boccaccio, and not too distant from Dante either. He's younger than Dante, but such an important, pivotal figure just in terms of intellectual history of the period. But the poems, these sonnets, are all about Laura, almost 99.5% of them. So these sonnets are written, well, it's interesting. He spent some time in Avignon in France, because when there was the whole papal discrepancies, and like the Pope moved to Avignon for a while, Petrarch was sort of in that time period, and that's when he first saw Laura and was thunderstruck by that, fell in love with her. It's not clear who Laura was. There are theories about that. I don't think she was fictional, though. I think this was definitely a real person. After reading all these poems, I feel like she had to be real. Like, he's not making up these emotions and so forth. So but it's not really clear how closely he really knew her, like, or how much they even talked, you know. So this was very much love from afar and unrequited. And but boy, was he in love with her, you know. And this kind of sets the template for love poetry for the next how many hundred years. He's also, again, this is the Avignon tie-in, southern France, Provence region. Like, he has definitely been influenced by the medieval troubadour poets, the lyric poets, who were also writing a lot about romantic love and courtship and so forth. That's obviously rubbed off on him, but what he's doing here is he's kind of writing in Italian and sort of casting all this in the sonnet form. So these are your traditional Italian sonnets, 14-line poems, and the Italian sonnet is basically an 8-6 pattern where the first 8 lines kind of cohere thematically and rhyme scheme wise, and then the sestet, the last 6, kind of make a turn the subject around in some way and can be considered its own unit of meaning. And this is, this is the guy who's doing it sort of for the first time, or most famously, and doing it really well. So the book, about the first 2/3 of the sonnets are about his love for Laura, his longing for her, and just the love sickness that this inspired in him. And it's really an anatomy of that kind of unrequited love, how that feels, and it's very intricate, very powerful. You really sort of feel bad for the guy, pining the way he is. And he's putting this woman on a pedestal for sure. You know, you can't help but think of Beatrice from Dante's La Vita Nuova. I don't know if Petrarch had read that book, but there's definitely parallels. And, just being so stricken with attraction and longing for this one person, and idealizing them. Like, that's what this book is about. I'd say the first 2/3 of the sonnets are all about that. And then this last third, roughly, are sonnets about Laura after she died. So she died young. I believe she died from the plague, an outbreak of the plague. And the tenor of the poems really changes at that point. And you see Petrarch grappling with that loss. What do you do with that? And lots of really sad poems. Fascinating though, like how he's trying to, well, I'll see her in heaven, and he's sort of thinking a lot more about, bring death on, and, or she's in a better place, and all that kind of stuff. But there's also a lot of poems about like how much life sucks right now because she's not around anymore, and I have to live in the past, I have to live in my memories. So if you've ever been deeply in love with someone, especially someone who you love from afar, I mean, you can't help but connect with Petrarch's sonnets. So definitely a great book. Definitely a great book. A beautiful edition. This is just in great condition, and I'm happy I've got around to reading it. It's been on the shelf for maybe 2-3 years since I bought it used, and this was a perfect time to read it. Like, that's why the Sarah Bakewell book is good, because she sort of leads you into these other directions. There's other thinkers that are on my radar now, thanks to her. But anyway, the only thing I would say about this edition is, like, the translations leave a lot to be desired, just being honest. Like, I'm going to try to find a paperback edition of Petrarch and compare translations. It would be fun to do that. All right, so that's that. Now, there's another new acquisition that I don't think I talked about this, but I got this a couple weeks ago at the used bookshop that's run by our senior center in town. And every now and then you can find really cool leather-bound copies on the cheap. So I got this, which is Joyce Carol Oates' You Must Remember This, a novel that I believe came out in the 80s. And it's published by Franklin Library. Again, your standard sewn-in bookmark, gilt edges. This is leather-bound. And the cool thing about this is it's a signed first edition. That's Joyce Carol Oates' signature. That wasn't the only signed edition they did of hers. And this is a used copy. Now, it was marked as $12 inside. And when I went, I was willing to pay that. I thought that's not bad for a signed edition. And I took it up front to the register, and I showed the lady the price, and she's like, no, I'm not sure that's right. And she went to this other lady. She's like, so what they usually do with these sort of nicer books is they'll put a little sticker with a price on it. Well, this didn't have a sticker, and they just gave it to me for the standard price for a hardcover. So I got this signed first edition of a Joyce Carol Oates novel, You Must Remember This, for $6. I call that a bargain. I was really happy. Now the book is, I started it, and so far it's good. It has really cool illustrations too. So this is set in upstate New York, where she's originally from. This is not far from Buffalo, I believe. And it's partly about a boxer. There's apparently some incest involved, like sort of like forbidden love attraction between like an uncle or a half uncle and like a younger girl. And you know, it might not be to the taste of everyone, but Joyce Carol Oates often tackles these kinds of themes of violence and forbidden romance and, you know, gothic kind of things. One review I read of it called it, they compared it to Raging Bull with incest. But, you know, I haven't gotten far enough into it to make any kind of judgments on it, but it's certainly well written. I'm only like 26 pages into it, but I didn't buy the book for the subject matter. I wasn't familiar with the novel at all, but the fact that it's a signed edition, and I do like Joyce Carol Oates. I mean, everything I've read by her has been good, so I thought, why not for $6? So if I get around to finishing it, I'll do a better review of it. And I'm still reading my Aristotle for Everybody, Mortimer Adler. I'm trying to make a push on this to get through it. It's not a very long book at all, but boy is it dry. Like, it's kind of pedestrian. It's an introduction to Aristotle's thought, but it's done in a very sort of plodding, pedestrian, kind of redundant kind of way. It has its uses, I guess, like if you were brand new to Aristotle, and certainly Mortimer Adler knows his Aristotle. so it's got the air of authority to it. But it's kind of a hard read just because it's kind of stale. It reads kind of stale. So I hope to finish that this weekend. And I just started this, Jorge Luis Borges Collected Fictions, which I've had on the shelf for years. I don't know how many years, at least 10 years. And again, another author where everything I've read by him has been good. But I haven't even come close to reading all his stories. And this is basically the collected fictions. And I've only just read the first story, The Cruel Redeemer, Lazarus Morel. But, it has all the short fiction books that he issued. So I'm really looking forward to this. I've been wanting to read some shorter stuff, and this is a great way to do it. I think he's one of the 20th century's masters in terms of fiction, and look forward to getting deeper into that soon. Of course, I'm reading about 5 or 6 or 7 other books at the same time, but that's some of the newer stuff. What have you been reading? I'd love to know. What do you think about these books I've shared? Let me know in the comments. Happy reading, and I hope to see you again soon.